I was already bracing myself before I even pulled onto my parents' street in Huntersville, the late evening sky over North Carolina fading into that muted purple that usually makes me feel calm. But that night only made the weight in my chest feel heavier, because I knew that by the time I parked and walked up to the front door for Alyssa's 34th birthday dinner, I would have to pretend that everything in my life was stable, that my marriage to Nicole wasn't quietly splintering in ways I didn't fully understand yet. Even though for months now something between us had been shifting in small, unsettling ways that were impossible to ignore. I'm 41, a regional supply chain director at a mid-sized manufacturing firm in Charlotte, and I'm used to managing disruptions, forecasting problems, tightening processes before they spiral out of control. But nothing in my professional skill set prepared me for the slow unraveling happening inside my own home, where Nicole, 37, had gone from being my partner in every mundane ritual to someone who seemed perpetually irritated by my presence, as if I had become an inconvenience. She tolerated rather than a husband she chose. It started subtly enough that I convinced myself it was stress, maybe burnout, maybe just a normal friction of two adults juggling careers and responsibilities. But over time, the arguments became so trivial and so frequent that they felt engineered, like she was searching for reasons to create distance between us, snapping at me over the thermostat being set 2 degrees too low, accusing me of deliberately buying the wrong brand of almond milk, even though I had bought the exact one she'd written on the list, criticizing the way I reorganized the garage shelving, as if my method of stacking storage bins revealed some deeper character flaw. There was a sharpness in her tone that hadn't been there before, a tightness around her eyes whenever I tried to initiate a normal conversation, and every minor disagreement escalated into something disproportionate, as if we were arguing about betrayal instead of grocery receipts. And yet when I would try to slow things down and ask what was really going on, she would deflect or accuse me of being dramatic, telling me I was overanalyzing everything, that I always had to turn simple conversations into interrogations. At the same time, she became fiercely protective of her phone, a device that used to lie face up on the kitchen counter without a second thought, now always angled downward. Screen darkening the second I walked into a room, notifications silenced, passwords changed without explanation, and when I once casually picked it up to check the weather, because mine was charging, she reacted with a level of alarm that startled me, snatching it from my hand, as if I had crossed an invisible line I hadn't known existed. She told me she updated her passwords for security reasons, that everyone was doing it, that I was paranoid for reading into it, and I tried to accept that answer, because I wanted to believe that the woman I married was still the same person who used to laugh with me in the kitchen while we cooked dinner, who used to reach for my hand without thinking. But the pattern of secrecy layered on top of constant criticism made it impossible not to feel like I was living with someone who was slowly withdrawing her loyalty while pretending nothing fundamental had changed. As I turned off the engine in my parents' driveway and sat there for a moment, listening to the faint hum of cicadas in the humid evening air, I felt a familiar tension settle into my shoulders, that dull ache of anticipating another performance. Because I knew Nicole would be inside already, smiling at my parents, probably recounting some exaggerated story about how I loaded the dishwasher incorrectly or forgot to replace a light bulb fast enough, and I would nod along, play the self-deprecating husband, swallow the growing suspicion that the real issue was something neither of us was willing to say out loud. Nicole arrived 10 minutes late, just long enough for everyone to notice, just long enough for my mother Karen to glance at the hallway clock and make a small comment about traffic in Charlotte before smoothing her expression back into something polite. And when the front door finally opened, I felt my entire body tighten. Because even before I saw her face, I sensed that the entrance itself was deliberate. Time for maximum visibility, time so that conversations would pause and eyes would shift toward her. She stepped into the dining room wearing a sharp navy dress that fit her perfectly, structured and elegant in a way that looked more suited for a corporate networking event than a casual family birthday dinner. And for a split second, I almost forgot everything that had been happening between us, because she looked composed, polished, almost distant in her poise. But then my eyes dropped automatically to her left hand, and I saw the absence immediately, the bare space where her wedding ring should have been catching the light. She had told me earlier that it had started irritating her skin, that the band felt tight, that maybe she needed it resized, and I had nodded even though I had never once seen a mark or rash on her finger, and standing there watching her greet my parents without that ring felt like witnessing something quietly symbolic, something she wanted seen but not discussed. She avoided sitting next to me at the dining table with such subtle precision that no one else seemed to register it, choosing instead the chair across from my father and next to my sister Alyssa, offering a light explanation about wanting to be closer to the birthday girl. Her smile controlled and measured, while I took the seat beside my mother and felt the empty chair at my side like a small but unmistakable declaration. Her phone was placed face down on the table beside her plate, angled slightly toward her, and even though she kept it turned over, as if that gesture alone proved transparency, I watched her fingertips hover near it throughout dinner, lifting it into her lap every few minutes under the tablecloth, her gaze dropping briefly before she straightened again with a neutral expression, as if nothing had interrupted her attention. When my mother asked her about work, about the marketing campaign she had mentioned weeks ago, Nicole responded with flat, polite answers that contained just enough detail to seem engaged, but no warmth, no elaboration, no invitation for follow-up, her tone carefully even, her smile brief and close-lipped, and I could see Karen struggling to bridge the distance, asking about our recent weekend plans, about the house, about whether we were thinking of traveling this fall. Nicole's replies were efficient and detached, as though she were answering a survey rather than speaking to her in-laws, and every time someone tried to include her in a story or memory, she nodded with the same rehearsed expression, the same tilt of her head, never leaning forward, never relaxing into the rhythm of the conversation. And the more I watched her, the clearer it became that this was performance rather than participation. She had insisted on coming despite telling me earlier that she felt tired and overwhelmed, despite implying that family gatherings drained her lately. And as I observed the straightness of her posture, the deliberate way she crossed her legs and adjusted the hem of her dress, the way she laughed half a beat after everyone else as if calculating the appropriate response, I realized she had not come out of affection or obligation, but because she needed to be seen, needed witnesses, needed the optics of a composed wife attending her sister-in-law's birthday dinner. Every time someone glanced at us together, she subtly shifted her body so that we appeared aligned, but she never once reached for my hand, never once brushed her shoulder against mine, and the space between us felt engineered, curated, like everything else about her presence that evening. I sat there quietly, cutting into my steak, nodding at my father's commentary about work, and beneath the surface of polite conversation, I felt the slow clarity forming, the realization that Nicole was no longer trying to fix what was broken between us, but was instead constructing a narrative in which she appeared dutiful, composed, slightly distant, but entirely reasonable. And I understood in that moment that I was not her partner at that table, but a supporting character in a story she had already begun telling. After the cake was placed in front of Alyssa and the candles were lit, the entire room softened into that familiar warm glow that always comes with ritual, everyone leaning in slightly as she closed her eyes to make a wish. My mother held her phone up to capture the moment. My father, Gregory, standing back with his hands folded in front of him in that steady, reserved way he has always had, and for a few seconds I allowed myself to believe that the evening might pass without incident, that whatever tension Nicole and I carried could remain contained behind polite smiles until we drove home. Alyssa blew out the candles to scatter applause and laughter, and plates were passed around as my mother cut generous slices, the scent of buttercream and vanilla filling the dining room, forks clinking lightly against porcelain, conversation splintering into smaller threads about childhood birthdays and old family stories. And it was in that fragile pocket of normalcy that Nicole's entire demeanor shifted in a way so controlled and deliberate that I felt it before I even understood what was happening. She straightened her back slowly, as if aligning herself for a presentation, placed her fork down with careful precision beside her plate, and folded her hands together on the table, her phone still face down near her wrist, and the quiet firmness of that gesture drew my attention immediately, because it did not belong in the rhythm of casual conversation. Her voice, when she began to speak, was calm and measured, almost unervingly steady, and she did not look at me at first, but instead allowed her gaze to sweep briefly across the table, as though ensuring everyone was fully present. And then she said that she was done with the marriage, that she had been unhappy for over a year, that she had tried to make it work, but could no longer ignore the fact that she needed to rediscover herself and step away from a relationship that no longer served her. The words landed in the center of the table like something physical, something heavy enough to shift the air, and for a moment no one reacted because it was too abrupt, too incongruent with the setting, the half-eaten cake slices and birthday decorations forming a surreal backdrop to what sounded like a carefully rehearsed announcement. She then added, still composed, that she had chosen to say it here because in private I would minimize her feelings, that I would dismiss her concerns or rationalize them away, and she needed witnesses so that her truth could not be rewritten later. And hearing that accusation stated so calmly in front of my parents and my sister felt like being publicly assigned a role I had not agreed to play. Alyssa's fork froze halfway to her mouth, her expression draining of color as she stared at Nicole in disbelief, the birthday candle smoke still faintly lingering above the cake, and my father Gregory did not speak at all, but I saw the slight tightening in his jaw, the way his eyes shifted from Nicole to me and back again as it tried to assess something he could not yet define. My mother inhaled sharply, a reflexive sound confusion rather than anger, and the room seemed to shrink inward. Every small noise amplified, the hum of the refrigerator from the kitchen suddenly audible, the ticking of the wall clock too loud for silence that followed. I sat there, my hands resting on the edge of the table, feeling as though the floor beneath me had subtly tilted, and I realized with startling clarity that this moment had been planned with intention, that the posture, the timing after dessert, the reference to witnesses were not impulsive but strategic. And as I looked at Nicole's composed face, I understood that she had not only decided to end the marriage, but had chosen to stage its conclusion in a way that framed her as resolute and me as the unseen obstacle she had finally overcome. The silence after her announcement stretched long enough that I could feel everyone waiting for me to either explode or collapse, and I was aware of the expectation hanging in the air, the almost cinematic pause before the husband reacts. But instead of feeling the surge of anger or panic that she seemed to anticipate, I felt something colder and clearer settle into place inside me. The same composure I use in high-stakes meetings when a supplier misses a shipment and everyone else spirals wild. I focus on logistics. I kept my voice even and asked her what she wanted specifically, whether she was talking about separation or divorce, because those are two very different things, and if she was going to make a declaration in front of my family, then it deserved clarity, and the simplicity of the question seemed to throw her slightly off balance, because it did not match the emotional script she had prepared for. For a fraction of a second her eyes flickered, not dramatically, but enough for me to notice, and she shifted in her chair before responding that she was planning to move out temporarily, so she could have space to rediscover herself, that she needed time to think without the pressure of the marriage weighing on her, but she also wanted to remain in the marital home for a few months while she figured things out, as if the house were a shared amenity, rather than a shared responsibility. She explained this calmly, outlining it as though it were a practical arrangement, saying she could stay part of the week at a short-term rental or with a friend and part of the week at the house, suggesting we split time there so neither of us felt displaced, and she mentioned our golden retriever in the same measured tone, proposing that we alternate weeks with him, because she could not imagine not having him around while she went through this transition. The way she described it sounded less like a rupture and more like a lifestyle adjustment, and I could see confusion beginning to replace shock on my mother's face as she processed the idea that her son's marriage was apparently dissolving into a shared calendar. Nicole continued, her posture still impeccably straight, and said that she felt emotionally unfulfilled for a long time, that I was too structured, too predictable, too stable, and she emphasized those words as though they were deficiencies rather than qualities, explaining that living with someone so organized and consistent had made her feel boxed in, that my routines, my planning, my need for order had slowly suffocated her sense of spontaneity. She implied that my reliability had become monotony, that my calm had translated into emotional distance, that I did not challenge her or surprise her enough, and listening to her frame stability as failure felt surreal, because for years she had praised those same traits, had relied on them, had built our life on the predictability she now described as oppressive. I remained seated with my hands loosely clasped, nodding once as she spoke, not because I agreed, but because I understood that reacting emotionally would only validate the narrative she had just set in motion, and the more composed I remained, the more unsettled she appeared, as though my refusal to break down deprived her of the dramatic contrast she expected. She had prepared for anger, for pleading, for raised voices that would justify her need for witnesses, but instead she was faced with measured questions and controlled breathing, and I could sense the subtle shift in the room as my father continued to watch silently, my sister still frozen, my mother looking between us as if trying to decipher which version of reality she was supposed to accept. Nicole finished by saying she hoped we could handle this maturely, that she did not want things to become ugly, and as she spoke I understood that her calm was not vulnerability but positioning, that the months of coldness, the guarded phone, the calculated entrance, and now this public announcement were all pieces of the same carefully arranged picture, and I felt an unexpected steadiness settle into me, because if this was how she intended to end it, then at least the lines were finally clear. I let a few seconds pass after she finished outlining her version of events, long enough for the weight of her words to settle into the room, and then I spoke in the same calm tone I had maintained all evening, because if she was determined to present this as a clean emotional awakening, then I was not going to allow the timeline to be rewritten without context, and I told her that her dissatisfaction did not begin a year ago, that it did not start with my predictability or my routines, and that the narrative she was offering conveniently ignored a series of choices she had already made long before tonight. Her expression shifted almost imperceptibly, a tightening around her mouth. But I continued without raising my voice, explaining that over the past 8 months I had noticed late-night hotel charges posted to our joint credit card, charges at a boutique hotel less than half a mile from her co-worker Brandon Pierce's condo, always on evenings when she had claimed to be working late on marketing presentations, or attending after-hours networking sessions. I said his name deliberately, clearly, and the air in the room seemed to compress as it registered with everyone present, because this was no longer abstract dissatisfaction, but specific detail attached to a specific person, and I added that the ride-share receipts told the same story. Repeated trips to Midtown Charlotte at 10:47 p.m., 11:12 p.m., sometimes returning after 2 in the morning, all documented, all traceable, all paid from the same shared account she now wanted partially. Inhabit while rediscovering herself. Nicole inhaled sharply but did not interrupt, and I kept my gaze steady on her as I mentioned the 2 transfers totaling $19,400 moved from our joint account into her personal account 2 weeks before this dinner, transfers that were large enough to trigger automated alerts from the bank, and that she had dismissed at the time as routine financial housekeeping when I asked about them. I clarified that I had not confronted her publicly before, because I wanted to be certain of what I was seeing, because I believed in facts rather than suspicion. But since she had chosen to make a public declaration about emotional suffocation and personal growth, it felt necessary to acknowledge that the timeline of her rediscovery conveniently overlapped with hotel invoices, and late-night rides to an address that was not our homeroom fell into a heavy silence that felt almost physical. My sister staring at the table, my mother's fork resting untouched beside her plate, my father's expression unreadable but focused, and Nicole finally turned fully toward me, her composure cracking just slightly as she attempted to frame everything as harmless professional collaboration. She said Brandon and she had been working closely on a major campaign, that sometimes it was easier to book a hotel conference suite near Midtown rather than commute back and forth, that the rides were practical and the hours unpredictable, and she described a money transfer as precaution, something she did in anticipation of needing flexibility if we separated, insisting there was nothing inappropriate about maintaining financial independence. Her voice remained controlled but carried a faint edge now, as if she were recalibrating in real time, and I listened without interruption, because the explanation felt rehearsed but strained, layered with just enough plausibility to sound reasonable if one ignored the pattern as a whole. No one else spoke, and the birthday cake sat half-eaten in the center of the table. Candles melted into uneven wax pools, the sweetness in the air now cloying rather than warm, and I realized that the audience she wanted had not reacted with outrage toward me, but with a stillness that suggested doubt. And for the first time that evening, the careful symmetry of her performance looked less certain under the weight of documented facts. I waited until her explanation tapered off into that thin silence where justification hangs in the air without conviction, and then I spoke again with the same even cadence I had maintained all evening, because if there was going to be clarity in this room, it needed to be complete, and I told her that while she had been planning her transition, I had been planning as well, just not theatrically. I explained that 3 weeks ago, after the second unexplained transfer and the pattern charges that no longer aligned with overtime work, I separated our finances in a way that protected both of us from ambiguity, that I opened a new individual account, redirected my direct deposit from my firm into that account, and removed her authorized access to my personal credit cards, not out of spite but out of necessity, because financial transparency cannot exist in a marriage that is already being dismantled behind closed doors. I clarified that the joint account will remain intact for documented shared obligations until a formal division was agreed upon, but that I would not continue subsidizing discretionary expenses tied to what she described as rediscovery, and that any further transfers from shared funds without mutual agreement would be contested immediately. Her eyes widened slightly at that, and for the first time since she had placed her fork down, I saw uncertainty rather than confidence in her posture, because the assumption that I would continue providing structural stability during her departure had been woven quietly into everything she said. I added that I had already scheduled a consultation with an attorney specializing in family law, that the meeting was set for the following week, and that I intended to approach this process methodically and formally, not emotionally and not reactively, because when reputations and assets are involved, precision matters. The word attorney landed with a different kind of weight than anything else spoken that evening, heavier and more final, and I could sense the shift around the table as the focus moved from her declaration of unhappiness to the tangible consequences of dissolving a legal partnership. I stated clearly that I would not subsidize a transition, that I would not finance temporary rentals, hotel stays, or exploratory living arrangements while she decided whether I remained useful to her long term, and that I would not tolerate public humiliation framed as personal growth. If she wanted freedom, I said calmly, she could have it without resistance from me, but freedom meant autonomy in every direction, not selective independence paired with continued access to the infrastructure I built and maintained. I explained that a marriage cannot operate as both an exit strategy and a safety net at the same time, that she could not declare herself emotionally suffocated while expecting me to underwrite her search for air, and that if tonight was truly about honesty, Then we needed to acknowledge that choices have costs attached to them. The room felt different then, no longer centered on me as a potential villain in her narrative, but on her as the architect of a departure that suddenly carried financial and legal gravity. And I saw my father's gaze shift subtly toward her, no longer evaluating me, but waiting for her response. Nicole's composure faltered in small ways, her shoulders no longer perfectly squared, her fingers no longer resting neatly on the table but interlacing and then separating again, and the steady certainty she projected when announcing she was done now seemed edged with calculation rather than conviction. I remained seated, breathing evenly, aware that I had not raised my voice once, and in that stillness the emotional weight of the room no longer pressed down on me, but settled squarely in front of her, where the implications of her decision now stood, without cushioning. The next morning I gave her a defined window between 9 and 11 to collect whatever she considered essential, and I kept the interaction strictly procedural, because ambiguity is where manipulation thrives, and I had no intention of stepping back into that space after the clarity of the previous night. So when she arrived with 2 suitcases and the same navy composure replaced by oversized sunglasses and a loose sweater meant to signal vulnerability, I opened the door, stepped aside, and told her she could begin in the bedroom while I remained in the kitchen reviewing emails from work. I did not offer coffee, did not ask how she slept, did not reference the years we had spent building routines around that very house. And when she attempted to soften her voice and comment on how strange it felt to pack under these circumstances, I responded with brief, neutral acknowledgments that neither escalated nor soothed, because nostalgia is often the first lever pulled when control slips. She moved through the rooms deliberately, touching framed photographs as if considering which version of history to carry with her, occasionally pausing in doorways as though waiting for me to step into a sentimental exchange, but I stayed anchored to practical details we had already outlined, reminding her calmly to inventory anything she removed from shared spaces, so there would be no disputes later. At one point, she tried to pivot the tone, leaning against the kitchen counter and suggesting that perhaps we had both contributed to distance, that maybe in a different season of life we might have reconnected. And the implication hung there like an invitation to regret, yet I kept my voice level and reiterated that legal counsel would help clarify next steps. That speculation about alternate timelines would not change the current one. She shifted tactics again, attempting a lighter familiarity, brushing past me in the hallway with a faint, deliberate touch and remarking that we had always been good together in ways that mattered, as though physical proximity might blur the lines I'd drawn. But I stepped aside without reciprocation and returned to my laptop, refusing flirtation the same way I refused guilt, both designed to reopen doors I had already closed. It was around 10:30 when her phone, placed face up on the kitchen island for the first time in months, lit up with a notification that caught my attention only because the brightness reflected off the granite, and she moved quickly to pick it up, but not quickly enough to prevent me from seeing the name Brandon, and the first line of the message previewed across the screen. Her posture stiffened as she read it fully, the color draining from her face in a way that had nothing to do with our marriage and everything to do with whatever was unfolding beyond this house. And although I did not ask for details, the shift in her breathing was obvious, shallow and uneven, her earlier composure dissolving into something closer to alarm. She stepped into the adjacent room to take the call that followed, her voice lower but urgent, and fragments carried to the quiet house. Words like investigation and policy and HR surfacing in strained tones that bore no resemblance to last night's controlled narrative about self-discovery and emotional suffocation. When she returned to the kitchen, her confidence was fractured, the certainty that had framed her public announcement replaced by visible calculation, and I understood, without needing confirmation, that the professional collaboration she had described was no longer insulated from consequences. She looked at me then not with defiance, but with something unsettled, as if the story she intended to manage had slipped beyond her control. And in that moment it became clear that the marriage she had declared finished and the relationships she had quietly cultivated were collapsing simultaneously, leaving her without the dramatic arc she had carefully staged and without the safety net she had assumed would remain in place. Within a week, I moved deliberately through every practical step that should have been taken long before the public declaration, because once the emotional theatrics were stripped away, what remained was paperwork, property, and boundaries, and I refused to let hesitation turn into vulnerability. So the first thing I did after consulting with my attorney was change the locks on the house, not out of spite, but to establish physical clarity that matched the legal clarity already in motion. I informed her through formal channels that access would be coordinated and documented going forward, that personal pickups would be scheduled in writing, and that unannounced visits were no longer acceptable, and the act itself was not dramatic, but final. The sound of the new deadbolt clicking into place, carrying more meaning than any argument we could have had. The separation paperwork was filed methodically, every asset listed, every liability documented. And I drafted equitable division terms that reflected contributions rather than sentiment, laying out the value of the house, retirement accounts, savings, and vehicles with the same precision I applied to corporate forecasting models. Because emotion had already been weaponized once, and I had no intention of allowing it to distort the next phase. I retained primary custody of our golden retriever based on documented care history, veterinary records, and the simple fact that my schedule and residence were stable, and while she initially protested the decision in vague emotional language about shared attachment, she did not contest it formally once she understood the logistical and legal framework surrounding it. There were no shouting matches, no slammed doors, no late-night texts begging for reconsideration, because I removed the oxygen that fuels that kind of drama, and in doing so I felt something unfamiliar but steady return to me, a sense of ownership over my own environment that had been quietly eroded over months of walking on eggshells. Meanwhile, she attempted to reconstruct the narrative online, posting carefully curated statements about bravery, growth, and choosing oneself, framing the end of the marriage as a courageous act of self-preservation. Yet the reception was not what she anticipated, because the spectacle of announcing a separation at a birthday dinner and the subsequent unraveling of her professional situation had already circulated quietly among extended family and mutual acquaintances. I did not respond publicly, did not counter her posts, did not defend myself in comment sections, because silence can be more definitive than rebuttal, and I watched from a distance as the tone of responses shifted from initial sympathy to subtle questioning. Relatives asking privately why things had unfolded so theatrically, friends noting inconsistencies in timelines she had once described differently. The extended family who had sat frozen at that dinner did not echo her portrayal of events, and even those inclined toward neutrality expressed discomfort with the public spectacle, and without the dramatic villain she'd expected me to become, her story lost momentum, flattening into something far less heroic than she had envisioned. I continued going to work, walking the dog each morning, paying a mortgage, and organizing the garage the way I always had, and the predictability she once labeled suffocating felt instead like stability reclaimed. And I realized that I had not needed to raise my voice to regain control, that refusing to bargain with disrespect had done more than any argument could have accomplished. In the quiet that followed, I understood that composure is not passivity but discipline, and that standing firm without theatrics had shifted the weight of the entire situation away from me, leaving me not as a man who had been publicly left, but as the one who had calmly stepped forward into a life no longer dependent on someone else's approval.